Education in Colorado in the 1860s was rudimentary. In terms of introducing people to a classical education, there were no institutions between St. Louis and San Francisco.
This was known as the Great American Desert. You can see that emblazoned on maps.
How did this university survive? How did they get through the rough times? How did they attract students?
We have a big stake in Denver, and Denver has a big stake in us.
The university has turned out an amazing number of graduates over the past 150 years who will make an impact not only on the community and in the state, but in the country and in the world.
Colorado Experience is made in partnership with History Colorado,
inspiring generations to find wonder and meaning in our past and to engage in creating a better Colorado. HistoryColorado.org.
with funding provided by the University of Denver, celebrating 150 years, the Denver Public Library, the Colorado Office of Film, Television, and Media, with additional funding and support from these fine organizations and viewers like you. Thank you.
To understand the early history of Denver and Colorado Seminary, we have to understand just how vulnerable the community out here was on the Front Range, how recently the migrants had come, how tenuous their relationship was, how quickly people moved in and out of what was then called Denver. This is compounded by the threat that Denverites feel by Native American tribes living on the plains. Despite the fact that many of these tribes are peaceful, there's a sense of threat, a sense of opposition, particularly heightened during the Civil War itself.
It was very rough, very transient as well. And the people who came out here were of two varieties. They either were here to get rich and get out quickly, or they were business people who came here with the hope of staking a future and help building up this pioneer community and getting rich in the process. And for those business people, what was most important is that they developed the institutions of stability: churches, schools, banks, businesses, places where they could sink down roots and create a sense of permanence, which they hoped would attract more people to this pioneer town.
To understand the founding of the University of Denver, you must understand John Evans. And I always say John Evans was a man who was in the right place at the right time. He was a physician in Illinois and very active in the Republican Party, and was an early friend of Abraham Lincoln's and one of his early supporters for the presidency. After Lincoln becomes president, he offers John Evans the Territorial governorship of Colorado, which he accepts and comes out in the early 1860s. And one of the first things Evans wants to do is found an institution of higher learning so that students don't have to go back east to go to college.
He was a very strong Methodist, and Methodists have established universities all over the country, and some major ones. So it was a part, I think, of his DNA to foster education, encouraged people to read the scriptures, and that's who he was.
He's a man who's deeply tied to both material and spiritual progress. He believes that civilization rests both on the church and the advancement of education. And I think the deep sense of instability out here on the frontier, the very tenuous population here in Denver after the gold rush, heightened his sense that what was really needed was some kind of foundation that he could anchor in a university, or a seminary, as he called it.
It's, of course, important to remember that building a university in the 1860s in a place like Colorado was a risky business. The chances for it to fail were extraordinary. People weren't coming here to get an education or to create a secure future for themselves. They were coming here to get the gold and to go home. And It's an act of astonishing faith and vision to move forward and build a university and try and create a grounding for some kind of future in Colorado.
From the time he envisions the university until the time it opens, from 62 to 64, he spends much of his energy gathering trustees, thinking about people who will invest in the institution, and publicizing the possibility.
He worked with other pioneer leaders, people like William Byers, the publisher of the Rocky Mountain News, David Moffett, who was an important financier and later a railroad builder, and many, many others, members of the Methodist clergy, to create a foundation that would help support an institution of education, and particularly of higher education. As a Methodist minister, John Chivington was an obvious candidate to become a trustee of the seminary. He was an individual who was regarded with the highest reputation in pioneer Denver because he was a man of God.
John Chivington is in charge of organizing a regiment of Colorado militiamen here at the same time that John Evans is bringing him ever more closely into the founding of what will become the Colorado Seminary. He's deeply concerned about the attack of Confederates on Denver, but there is also an equal concern about Native tribes that are hostile to those living in Denver.
As the military commander of the District of Colorado, he was the architect of the Sand Creek Massacre, an attack on a group of defenseless Cheyenne and Arapaho people who believed that they were under the protection of the United States government. John Evans, of course, denied complicity with the massacre. He presented evidence to prove that he hadn't been involved. And in fact, he left the territory just prior to the massacre as well. But it's really hard to imagine that he wasn't somehow aware of John Chivington's plans. He certainly defended the actions after the massacre.
One of the interesting things that historians have always wondered about, and I've wondered about, is these two men, John Evans and John Chivington, were abolitionists in the war and fought to free the slaves. And then they come out here and do what they did to Native Americans. There's a lot of discussion about what does the university do to somehow come to some resolution or resolve about Sand Creek. And there is dialogue going on now about this very topic.
In the wake of the Sand Creek Massacre, John Evans found his political reputation on a national level completely shattered. And in fact, he never served in political office again. But he remained popular as a civic leader in Colorado, and as a philanthropist, as a business developer, as a town founder and a university founder. He continued to have a lot of, ironically, moral influence over the development of Colorado in the rest of the 19th century.
At the same time that this was occurring in the fall of 1864, the Colorado Seminary opened its doors for its first class of students.
It was first located around 13th and Arapaho downtown, about where the DCPA parking garage is today.
The original building was the tallest building in town. There were no three-story buildings in Denver. The fact that they built it out of brick represented a kind of permanence that was an important symbol. Those anchors of progress and of civilization that were so important to boosters like John Evans and William Byers really had to be created from the ground up. Denver itself was really only about 5 years old, just out of its toddler years.
The problem is that the Colorado Seminary is deeply tied to the city of Denver. And as the fortunes of Denver begin to fail with the end of that initial gold rush, so too the Colorado Seminary struggles to get students.
You might argue that creating the Denver Seminary in the 1860s was a little bit ahead of its time. The university got off the ground, but it really struggled during its first years. There just wasn't the population to support it. And of course, as a vision, it struggled. In 1868, in fact, it closed, and it wasn't for another 12 years until Denver's population really boomed after the arrival of the railroad, after silver began flowing out of the mines into Denver. That's when there was a stable enough community for a place like the University of Denver to succeed.
When it reopens in 1880, it has the same mission and ambition, but it has a different name, the University of Denver.
In the 1880s, when they reopened, Denver had grown, and this area had become kind of a rundown, kind of red light district with brothels and saloons, and these were good Methodists who could not live with that. So they started looking for an area outside of town where they could found a kind of a utopian educational area or a university park.
John Evans and the trustees began looking around for another possible location, and they had a number of options, but the most attractive option was a plot of land south of Denver in what was sort of the far reaches of the metropolis. What was attractive about that land was that it was owned by a potato farmer named Rufus Clark. Rufus Clark was one of the most colorful individuals in early Denver history. A tall, swaggering, giant, profane man with a mane of gray hair. At 16, he had signed up on a New England whaling ship and had traveled all the way around the world. Had gone to the Arctic Circle, had shipwrecked in Australia.
He had a very widespread reputation on both oceans for being able to drink any man under the table and for being an extraordinary user of the bordellos, that he would go and stay a week. And everybody knew who Rufus Clark was and thought they knew something about him.
Somehow in 1859, he had made his way to Colorado and began farming outside of Denver. He was so successful at it, particularly in growing potatoes, that he was soon nicknamed Potato Clark. And by the 1870s and 1880s, he was the largest landowner in the territory of Colorado. Through all of that, he was still a ruffian, a reprobate, a scoundrel. But one day in the 1870s, he staggered drunkenly into a tent revival in Denver, and he found religion. And on the spot, reformed his ways. He gave up drink, he gave up cursing, he gave up all the fun things in life. But what he did do is began to give away his riches to help other people. And it was very important for him to be involved in the expansion and growth of the University of Denver. He gave an endowment of 500 acres, along with money to support the growth of the university south of Denver. And that donation of land provided the core of DU as we know it today. With the relocation of the university to the southern edge of Denver, the city was really obligated to develop infrastructure, sewer lines, streetcar lines, lay out neighborhoods, create community resources to allow people to move to the south fringes of the city and really develop this part of the city into what is really the gems of the city of Denver today.
Houses start to be built and the area starts to grow. There is a lot of land speculation going on. The university was having some difficult financial times and asked Reverend Buchtel to become chancellor of the university. Henry Augustus Buchtel, or Buchtel, was a Methodist minister, and he was known as a tremendous fundraiser. An old story that went around at the time was that a young boy swallowed a quarter. His mother was screaming, "What will we do? What will we do?" And someone said, "Call Chancellor Buchtel. If he can't get the quarter out of him, nobody can." He was a very successful fundraiser for DU and built a number of new buildings on campus, including a science hall, a new Carnegie Library, a Buchtel Chapel. Well, of course, you had the Depression, the late 20s that goes into the 30s, and so, everybody was having financial issues. So the 30s were not a prosperous time. And then, of course, during the war, it was tough because so many were gone off as soldiers.
During the Second World War, the University of Denver really shifted into a different gear. It saw its enrollment of civilian students really begin to drop, but those students were replaced by military trainees, people training in a glider pilot program. They trained military engineers and people in the military service sector in order to help support the soldiers overseas. But when the war ended, the university saw its greatest enrollment jump in its history. And this had a lot to do with the GI Bill. Of course, there's a price to success. And in this case, there was not adequate housing or classrooms, and university officials really had to improvise in order to bring buildings to this site. So they scrounged all over for military buildings, surplus military buildings from Fort Logan or Camp Hale up in the Rocky Mountains. They even brought buildings from the Japanese internment camp of Amachi to this site to create provisional housing and additional classrooms in order to buy the university time so that they could catch up with their burgeoning student population.
It was still a smallish town at that time. The big burst hadn't happened yet. I wore a skirt to class every single day. And the men were all slacks and a nice shirt and sometimes a nice sweater. But we all looked pretty spiffy when we went to class. And the women who lived in the dorms had a curfew. Woof. I mean, if you weren't through the door by 10, sometimes you were allowed to stay out till 10:30. You were in trouble.
Then the team comes out of the locker rooms, and you, the old grads, join the student body to roar a welcome to the players as they run out on the field to defend their record in the Skyline Conference.
I was in the marching band. We did a very fast cadence with high knees, up and down, and it was very impressive when we came on the field. And after the football games, if we won, we would go to the chapel, which no longer exists, just one tower of the chapel, and ring the bell the number of points that the Pioneers scored on the football field. Football was great fun. They called us Tramway Tech because the old tram ran out this way, and the business people of Denver were anxious to find good employees. So many of the students on campus were in jobs while we were in school. The people who were going to be teachers were out doing their student teaching as a senior, not as a graduate student. People in business had already found jobs in business. They went to work as soon as they were through with their classes. And it did help us with our learning and with our grades.
Among the people who have had the biggest influence on the university in the 20th century, Chester Alter, certainly, the chancellor from 1953 to 1967. He was a physicist and was responsible for building, again, a number of buildings on campus. What, unfortunately, Chancellor Alter is often remembered for is dropping football. He believed that he wanted the university to be known as a great scholarly institution and not a jock factory, which he felt some of the state schools might be. And it's true that athletes at the time were getting preferred treatment, and that was one thing that really rubbed Chester Alter the wrong way, that he did not like, was preferred treatment for athletes. And so we dropped football.
The 1960s and 1970s were, of course, turbulent times on college campuses throughout the nation between the civil rights movement and turmoil over the Vietnam War. College campuses were a place for civic discussion, for civic protest, and sometimes for violence. On May 4th of 1970, a student protest over Vietnam at Kent State in Ohio turned violent, and 4 students were shot by Ohio National Guard. Another 12 students were injured in that confrontation. And certainly at universities throughout the nation and in Colorado, students came forward to their administration to protest this treatment, both the war in Vietnam and the treatment of students at Kent State.
It was an exciting time, but it was also a scary time. It's very hard to describe, but it permeated everything. And by 1969, 1970, you weren't wearing skirts anymore. There was a big changing scene.
Some 5,000 students rallied in protest of the shootings at Kent State, and they turned what started out as a destructive impulse to burn and destroy into a creative impulse to learn and build. And students began building what they called Woodstock West. It was a shanty town on the campus of the University of Denver of found and scrounged materials where they could create their own classrooms to talk more about the Vietnam conflict, to talk about what had happened at Kent State, to educate themselves about the issues that they confronted right at that moment.
We had a sit-in, a demonstration overnight, and the next morning when you woke up, the National Guard was here. The crazy thing was, and I remember it so distinctly, was so much of the National Guard, Colorado National Guard, were our fellow students and our contemporaries and our peers. And they no more wanted to be in their tanks and their predecessors to Humvees than we wanted them there.
The newspaper coverage of these student protests was somewhat strange. Authorities in Colorado and elsewhere didn't want to acknowledge that this turmoil was more that they could handle, and the headlines in the Rocky Mountain News reflected this. After Kent State, 10,000 students rallied at the University of Colorado, 5,000 students at the University of Denver, and students at CSU rioted and burned down their old main campus. But the headline said that, in general, Colorado college students are taking the news of Kent State fairly well, except at CU and at DU and at Colorado State.
Maurice Mitchell was the chancellor at the time, and he refused to close DU, which was very unusual because most universities having student protests at that time were closing. Mitchell felt that it was more important to keep the university open to have dialogue going on. Mitchell did take down the tent city that the students had built, but he did it because the university was receiving threats from anonymous callers saying, we're going to shoot at students who are camped out there. So Mitchell felt we have to get this down before somebody gets hurt.
The leaders at the university, I believe, looking back at it 40 years later, handled it very well. It could have been confrontational. It was not.
That class, or those 4 years of students that were here at that time, are some of the biggest supporters of the university today, have the fondest memories of it, even though they were involved in this anti-war protest.
I like to say you should look at a building and smile. It's not just the buildings, but it's the surrounding things and how they relate to one another.
Another very significant chancellor was Dan Ritchie, who of course served in the 90s, and like Buchtel, was just a master fundraiser and built a number of buildings under his term and gave money himself for the Ritchie Center.
In the role of chancellor, your role is really to surround yourself with really good people that you can trust and who share the values that you have, and support them and get out of the way. Ultimately, it's about how well we do our job in teaching and learning and in recruiting good students. And we again made character an important part of what we look for in a student.
I think that we're still only beginning to see the impact of the University of Denver, because only within the past few decades have we seen more diverse students come to the university. People from around the world, people of different ethnicities, more women, people with disabilities, a lot of them coming now to the University of Denver and then taking the ideas, the things that they learned here, and spreading them throughout the world. And it really begins, in my opinion, with a lot of the professors who open up that conversation, who are coming from diverse perspectives, whether that be religion, ethnicity, sexuality, personal beliefs, and they open up that conversation for everyone.
Joseph Corbel was a Czech scholar who came to the University of Denver to teach in the late 40s, 1949, in the School of International Studies. And later, after his death, the school was named for him, the Corbel School. His daughter was Madeleine Albright, who would become the future Secretary of State of the United States.
Our father really cared so deeply about the school and the University of Denver. And for me, he was a father, but also a great professor. And so if I can see that as being exciting for other students of international relations, then it validates so many aspects of his life.
Dr. Corbell was a magnificent storyteller. He was someone who made international politics and the Soviet Union come alive. It really was this course that led me to believe that there was another future for me.
It's really quite amazing when you think about Denver being almost in the middle of the country, that it really is seen as a locus and a center for international law and just internationalism. With the Corbell School and, of course, Madeleine Albright's father, Condi Rice, receiving a degree here, it became evident that we had a real jewel here in Denver.
The first debate of the 2012 election was held at the University of Denver. There's a reason why this school was chosen as the first place for a debate that people around the world were watching, and it is because those two candidates knew that the University of Denver could not only host them and the things that they needed, but also could help them get their messages out to all different parties and offer a platform for people to submit their questions, to voice their concerns, and really be heard and taken seriously by a university that really takes politics, business, and so many other world issues very seriously.
It brought the United States to Denver, and the university continues to do that on a national and through Corbell and the International School international level. But maybe what's most important to me and what drew me back to the university is the impact it's making in Denver. And there are many more Coloradans who now know about this university and are making a difference. And they're going to stay in this state, and they're going to make a difference in the future for the people of Colorado. And that makes me very proud.
Looking back over 150 years, there's a lot to learn and a lot to appreciate. That the times change and you have to change with it, and times are changing now. And we go through phases and we learn. But I think the whole idea of getting good, bright, committed people together, the chemistry of that and the impact of the social learning, that is important, and also the whole idea of ethics and honor and those kind of things are still, in my view at least, every bit, if not more important than ever. The sense of not just living for this year, but thinking about future generations and what we can contribute and what we should be doing. And that really does go back to those early roots. Methodists were really an important influence in the West, in the building of the West, and in education in this country as well.
The University of Denver brings so many assets to Denver and to Colorado. That really fits into the vision of an entrepreneur like John Evans. I think he would be very proud to see the young people that come out of this college community and who help improve this state. That was right in line with his original vision for this university.